Well, hello, everybody. We've got an opportunity for a great conversation today. Max Dawson is joining us. Max serves as an evangelist and one of the shepherds for the Dowling Road congregation in Beaumont, Texas. Max, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, Philip. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing as well as can be expected and probably better than I deserve. So what we're going to be talking about today is the subject of shepherding. We're going to try to have a great conversation to break down at least the surface level ideas to develop a better appreciation for the work of an elder, an overseer, a bishop, a shepherd in the context of congregations like we see in the New Testament and like we desire to have today. I think it's a really important subject, and I know Max is very passionate about it. So, Max, let's get
Well,
right down to the heart of it.
yeah, Philip, it has indeed been my passion. Over the past 10 or 12 years, I've spoken to more than 50 congregations about the work of shepherding. I've spoken in churches in Florida, from Florida all the way to California. And I can report today that I think there's something really good happening right now. And that is a lot of churches are gravitating away from some older, ineffective models to the biblical model of shepherding. You know, for years, we referred to the church leadership as our elders. And elders is certainly a scriptural term. It's used in a number of places in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 20 and verse 17, Paul called for the elders of the church at Ephesus. But as time has progressed, those elders oftentimes have just been decision makers for churches. A lot of churches, they serve kind of like as a board of directors. And that's really an ineffective thing for them to merely be decision makers. And so the idea of moving away from just being decision makers to being men who truly shepherd the flock of God, that's the direction that a lot of churches are going today. And I've done a lot of work on this. Roger Schaus has done work on it. Don Truex, and a number of other brothers across the country have been doing teaching for elders and for churches about men serving truly as shepherds in the flock of God.
Right. And, you think about our individual experiences. We represent perhaps two different generations because of the disparity in our age. I've lived on the West Coast, on the East Coast, and a few places in between. And I've seen how this change has taken place positively. And one of the things that meets our goals here with Do the Work is to talk a little bit about the process to both understand what's behind the change, like the factors that make this change relevant, but also the teaching tools that we need to develop to become more effective evangelists and gospel teachers and gospel preachers in this regard. Max, what's your experience level in regards to saying, this is the way that I shifted my preaching? We'll start there. We've got a lot of stuff we're going to talk about on my little note list, but let's start right there.
Well, I began to see really back in the 1980s that there was something lacking in our leadership at Dowling Road Church. And I've seen it in a number of other churches that we reach a level, we come up to a certain level and we plateau. Well, churches aren't able to grow beyond a certain point. And one of the reasons for that is the leadership style. And while we may be evangelistic, we may convert people, we lose an awful lot of those people because they're not being properly shepherded. And one of the problems, one of the things that has led to that is that the evangelist, he's expected to find contacts, study with them, convert them to Jesus, and then he's expected to do the follow-up work. And it really comes down to being like a one-man show. And after a while, he gets spread so thin doing all that work that he's not effective in the work. And I remember one church a number of years ago where the elders called the preacher in to an elders meeting and said, look, our attendance is dropping off, and we want to know what's going on. What's happening? And the preacher said, well, you tell me. You are the elders. I'm not. And what it was, they expected him to do all the shepherding of the sheep. And when the preacher does all the shepherding, it doesn't work very well. In fact, there's something that I've seen that churches have moved away from, and that is where you have an evangelist who does not only work of evangelism, but he does most of the shepherding of the sheep. The elders instead of them doing shepherding, they often do the work that ought to belong to deacons. Elders lock and unlock the building. They set the thermostats, turn the lights on and off, building repair. They make sure it's all done. And then the deacons, well, they're not sure what their job is supposed to be. And
Yeah.
as a result of that, things aren't working well. No one's happy in that arrangement, and churches do not function well when things are out of order. Remember when Paul wrote to Titus in Titus chapter 1 and verse 5, he said, I left you in Crete that you might set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every church. And there were things lacking in those churches. And when we've got an out of order situation in churches today, there's something lacking. And so there needs to be a return to the biblical order.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think about this on a couple of practical levels and the way in which preachers develop. Typically, even if the man has been part of a training program, some sort of internship, maybe he has a college education that's relevant to preaching, the first places he's going to be preaching are likely to be smaller groups. Maybe they'll have two elders. Maybe they don't have men who are suitable for that role just yet. And so a lot of this elder workload just unfortunately just drops right in that guy's lap. And he has two options, generally speaking. He can suck it up and say, well, someone has to do it and no one else is doing it, so I'm going to do it. And that's not healthy. Or he can push back. Well, when he pushes back without great teaching or some background knowledge for the rest of the congregation, they're like, well, why is the preacher throwing what we think his work is back on us? There's a teaching moment that needs to take place early on in the relationship of an evangelist and a congregation so that they can clearly distinguish what those roles are and how good it is when people are in the right place at the right time doing the right thing. And biblically, that's the model that really sees the great growth in the New Testament.
Well, that's right. And I think, Philip, it's not just teaching the men who would be shepherds, but it's teaching the congregation. It has to teach the congregations to look at their leaders in a different way. Most of the time, when people have a problem in the church, they tend to gravitate to the preacher. They go to the preacher and say, well, there's something wrong here or wrong there. Or even if it's something like a light out in the ladies' restroom, well, you go tell the preacher. Like one lady in our congregation said, I go to the head man. Well, the preacher is not the head man by any means. He's a teacher. He's an encourager. He's an exhorter. But I think a congregation has to be re-educated. Let me tell you how it happened in our congregation at Dowland Road. And this took place, I guess, 12, 14 years ago now. We had one of our elders, Pat Riley was his name. He'd been an elder for about a year. And we pretty much were operating on board of directors model. We'd gather together, we'd make decisions, and we'd announce our decisions to the congregation, and that's what we did as elders. And I'd been fighting that for a long time, but without much success. However, after Pat had been an elder for about a year, he came to an elders meeting and said, I've just been diagnosed with prostate cancer. I'm going to die. The doctors have told me that I have the most aggressive form. I have between 2 and 7 years to live. And he said, the kind of work that I've done as an elder over this 1 year that I've been serving, he said, I'm not happy to meet God with the kind of work that I've done. I've either got to resign from the eldership or we've got to change the way we do things. Well, that was the trip hammer. That was what we needed to get us over the hump and say, we're going to do things differently. And so we studied on the eldership for several weeks. We got with our deacons, and then we got up before the congregation and we said, starting now, we're changing. We've made mistakes in the past. We have not been the kind of men that this congregation needs to really shepherd the flock. And we had to begin at that point to re-educate the congregation, to teach them to look to their leaders, look to their elders as shepherds, as men who were there to help them, to guide them, to lead them, to nurture them, all of those things. One of the things that we wanted to get past, and you've probably seen this too, Philip, was an elder says to you, hey, I need to have you in my office for 10 minutes after service. And the first reaction is, uh-oh, what have I done? And we
Yeah.
wanted to get our congregation past that uh-oh moment. That when a shepherd speaks to you, you know it's someone who cares about you. Instead of getting called into the principal's office, like a lot of us did when we were in eighth grade or something like that, we know that we've got someone who genuinely is trying to help us grow. And it was a process of re-educating our congregation, re-educating them on what the work of a shepherd was, what the work of deacons was, and the work of elders also, or the work of preachers also.
Right. For me, that process looked in a little bit different way. I didn't have that powerful emotive memory that just said, this is when we get it together. And we talked about this before we went live. For years, my preaching on the eldership focused on the criteria that's laid out in Titus and Timothy. And I would drill down into the details and do my very best to explain the text. And there's great value to that. There's nothing necessarily disruptive to a rich understanding of those qualities. But then a few years go by, and at the request of one of the members at Jerry Whitson Road, I did a lesson on what shepherding looks like. And we had a couple of other shepherds who were visiting in the audience who had been part of other congregations and were happened to be visiting that day. And both of them took me aside independently and directly said, that literally is the lesson I should have had before I started to serve. And that wasn't my intent. It wasn't like I said, we just didn't know what we were going to be doing. So that shifted part of my perspective as point one. Point two, and this is a shout out, if you will, was the conversation that you and Don Truax participated in, which, by the way, I'll link in the notes afterwards for others to see. Those two things helped me shift an understanding that says the criteria matters, but the criteria only matters in the context of what the work actually is.
Yeah, the first lesson that I did on this was back in 1986. I was preaching at the Northwest Church here in Beaumont. They asked me to come over and do a lesson on elders, and I was just beginning to learn. And it's the year I became an elder, in fact. But one of the things that I realized is that we've been appointing men as elders in churches all across the country who really are not leaders. A bishop is to be a leader. He superintends. He oversees others. A shepherd. What does Psalm 23 say? The Lord is my shepherd. He leads me. And so the idea of leadership was the first thing that I began to see that we were lacking. And part of the problem was, as we look at the qualifications, and if you list them all separately, you come up with about 26 different qualifications from 1 Timothy and Titus. The focus and emphasis has been on the family qualifications. If a man is married, first marriage, no divorce, and he's got kids who are Christians, we rush him into the eldership, whether he has been doing any work of shepherding or not.
Yeah.
But one of the texts that has impacted me on this is Ezekiel chapter 34. Maybe before we get to the end today, we might just quickly touch on Ezekiel chapter 34 because it has something to say about what shepherds are supposed to be doing. And in teaching on this, it's more than just teaching on the qualifications. We've got to teach men what shepherding looks like, what they must be doing.
Yeah. And you start piecing this puzzle together a little bit better. There's another component, and we'll probably try to cover this in the future in other conversations if the Lord allows us to do so. There are resources that exist for growth if you want to be a great teacher. There are resources that exist for growth if you want to be a better public speaker. What has been sorely lacking in the congregations that I'm aware of, and I can't speak for every church everywhere, but is resources to train competent young men and competent older men to do the work of a shepherd, either internally in regards to mentorship or externally in regards to special events of any type. Over the last year, I've tried to seek out answers to those things and find my own resources because I'm a big fan of what I call institutional knowledge. If someone's already figured out how to do the thing, go learn from them rather than figure out how to do it on your own. And so I've been really passionate about sharing information amongst those who are doing the work. And if I go visit a congregation and their eldership seems to have a good handle on learning and leading their flock, I like to ask them all the why questions I can think of. why do you do it this way? Why do you feel like this is valuable? I think that's something where those who are preaching in any capacity, and shepherds too, would be very benefited by if they would start seeking those same resources to share with the flock that they're part of, no matter what their particular role is in that group, so that they could see the change on a more personal level.
Right. I mentioned that I've been with about 50 different churches over the last several years talking about the shepherding model, the biblical model. And everywhere I go, almost without exception, I learn something new. As I watch these men in their congregation function, as I watch them interact with their evangelists, interact with their deacons, I'm constantly learning. And I come back to Dowling Road and say, okay, I was up in New Albany last week, here's what I learned. Or I was out at Fresno, California, I learned this. This is still a learning process. And just like being a Christian is a lifelong learning process, so it is with being a shepherd. And not only being a shepherd, but being a deacon. We've got to make sure that in the course of our 30 minutes or so today, we talk a little bit about the work of deacons, because I am persuaded that deacons are a critical element in making the shepherding model work. It's not enough for the men who serve as elders to shepherd the flock. They've got to have deacons who are supportive and who do their role well.
I think there's an interaction that takes place as an exchange of trust. You talked about how very often elders end up deacons end up wondering what they're going to do, and the preacher just runs around like a chicken with his head cut off, in essence, not knowing what to do because there's so much chaos going on. I think, in part of this process of change is going to be that the elders, the shepherds, they have to trust their deacons to do the work without micromanaging their behavior. And I think that's a failure point in the corporate model that does not have a place in the biblical model. If you say you're responsible for X, then that means you're trusting them up to the extent of whatever X requires. If they're the ones
that's
who are
your job.
The widows, get it done.
Yeah. And Acts chapter 6 and verse 3, I think, is critical in this regard. Acts chapter 6 is where you've got the problem where some of the widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And so the apostles said, it's not desirable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Therefore, brethren, seek out from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. And I think these men, everything we know about deacons, these men were appointed as special servants. And I don't want to get into a debate with anyone about whether they were deacons or not. There are some people, these were not deacons. Well, what's your point? The truth still stands that responsibility was given to these men to be over this business. And when we appoint deacons, we should appoint them to be over this business without, as you said, micromanaging their affairs. And again, let the deacons be in charge of the building, locking and unlocking, turning the lights on and off, building maintenance, even treasury, lawn maintenance outside, whatever needs to be done in that regard. Let the deacons do that work. And someone said, well, does that mean deacons get to make decisions? Well, of course it does. I hope so. Yeah, and these men who were appointed over this business in Acts chapter 6, Philip, you know they had to make decisions. They can't go run into the apostles and say, okay, today is Tuesday. What about Wednesday's menu? What do you want on the menu tomorrow? And do we have the authority to go and purchase this much meat and this many carrots and cabbage or whatever? If the apostles have to make all the decisions, they might as well do the work themselves. But these men were appointed over this business. I have one lady say, well, I just don't think we couldn't trust our deacons to make decisions about money. Well, what kind of deacons did you appoint if you can't trust them? These men ought to be trusted. And here's something that I think will stand. I've learned this, that churches that are doing well have deacons who are doing well. They make decisions, they take care of the business without having to run to the elders for every decision. If you watched, and I know you did, if you watched the video that I did with Don Truex, we talked about here's a deacon who comes to one of the elders and says, we need a new broom. And the elder says, wait a minute, I'll make a decision as to whether we need a new broom. Go get that broom, let me look at it. And sure enough, here's the broom they bought back in 1986, and it's worn down to a nub. And so he says to the deacon, okay, go to Target, Kmart, and Walmart, get 3 prices on brooms, bring the prices back, and the elders will meet, and we will make a decision. Now, I regard that as an extreme and absurd example. However, Don says he actually knows of a case where that happened. But deacons ought to have authority to make a decision about buying a broom without even discussing it with the elders. Why do elders need to know about spending $15 on a broom? Go buy the broom.
Right.
They ought to have the authority to do that.
Well, and I think there's some generational issues that come into this. There's behavior models like, well, this is the way we did it. When I was a deacon, I had to go to the elders to make every decision. And so now I'm an elder. So now I assume that's what I'm going to do. I'll say for me individually, this is a bit of a struggle. I like to do certain physical tasks. It's enjoyable to me. And I'm going to tell a little story. You probably have met Lewis Willis before. I am aware of the deacons where he was worshiping with at one point, hiding all the keys to the mowing shed so that he would stop mowing the yard. Because he had other things he needed to be doing, even though he loved to do that physical task. They're like, no, no, no. We're taking ownership of this. We need to do that because we want you to be free to do the other things you also need to do. As a newly minted elder over the last little while, that's a struggle for me, to let go. And I already know the guys are going to do a great job, but I also like to do some of those things. Well, and there's only so much of me to go around. There's only so much of the elders to go around. There's only so much time that can be invested. And so you have to say, it's going to be great. When this person goes and handles it, it's great because they're qualified to do it. They don't need me to do that thing anymore. And it's going to be awesome. Terry asked a question. We've already hinted on part of it. And by the way, Terry's not with us today. If you're wondering, he's taking care of some family matters that are really important. I'll mention a little bit more about it at the end of our broadcast. But he asked, how do finances factor into deaconing? And so I'm guessing we can kind of talk a little bit about the stretch of how do we navigate that financial concern? Because people have legitimate fears about financial matters at times and oversight and care.
Yeah. Well, look, what was involved in Acts chapter 6 involved some church funds if they're going to be buying food and whatever utensils and whatever they needed to feed these widows. So there's going to be some finances involved. What we have done at Dowland Road, and we have first of all, we see the elders and deacons as being on the same team. One of the worst things that ever happens in a church is where you have a power struggle where you have deacons who want to go one direction and the elders want to go a different direction. You can't have that. Elders and deacons have got to work together. At our congregation, we have quarterly meetings. In fact, we just had one a week ago this past Sunday, where we met with our deacons and we discussed a doctrinal issue with them to make sure we're on the same page. But elders and deacons have got to work together. And when we get into the fall of the year, about September, October, we begin to discuss our finances for the upcoming year. And elders and deacons work together. We take 2 or 3 of our deacons and a couple of our elders, and they start working on the budget. And what our deacons do in every area of service that they have, they will submit budget items for the next year. The AV man may say, well, we need a new amplifier for this. Someone who's in charge of outside maintenance say we've got to fix our gutters on the building, and so we're going to need a couple $1,000s to fix that. And so we all work together, cooperating together on the budget. And when it comes time then to put those new gutters on the building, the deacons don't come to the elders to discuss it. They just go ahead and do it because it's already been approved in a cooperative effort by elders and deacons together. And so, but no one gets to break the budget. Everyone has to operate within those restraints, just like in your home. Nobody gets to break the budget, and nobody gets to break
Yeah.
the church budget either. But deacons do have the authority to make decisions. If we need a piece of office equipment, if we need a new printer or something like that, deacons go do it, and we don't worry about it.
Right. I think the key terminology, at least from my perspective, to lean back on is trust. If you trust a man to move into the role, you've got to trust the man to do the work. And if he's going to serve as a special servant, Acts chapter 6 is an excellent model to look at and say, here it is. This is a model of service. And like you, I'm not going to quibble over whether they're deacons or not because the work is deacony. It's servant-like.
Yeah.
It's servant inside the context of the church. And so from the budgetary standpoint all the way to the practical stuff, you're going to trust each other and work together just like you would in any other relationship.
Right. And
Um,
it speaks in that text in Acts 6 of men of good reputation, full of the Holy Spirit, that is, under the influence of God's Spirit. They're being obedient to God, and also says full of wisdom. These are wise men that you've appointed, and so they ought to be trusted. And in the bottom line, we should build a relationship of trust, an umbrella of trust over the whole congregation. The congregation should be able to trust their shepherds to guide and lead them, trust the evangelist in the teaching, and indeed trust their deacons to carry out their responsibilities. And, we don't have to be at one another's throats and always having conflict. One of the reasons that churches today are declining is because brethren fuss and fight with one another and tear each other to pieces. The apostle warned in Galatians chapter 5, take heed, beware, he said, that you do not bite and devour one another. And so we've got to learn to get along, to work together, and as we work together as a team, we can accomplish so much more.
right.
I recommend that the biblical order, I recommend that the evangelists take the lead in evangelism outside the congregation and inside the congregation. Let the deacons do their work, and then let the shepherds take care of the sheep. Uh,
Yeah.
the problem is
There needs to
that
be
sometimes. No,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Well, I was going to use a powerful, at least to me, illustration, a way to think about it, to catch exactly what I think you're talking about. If you had a married couple and the wife goes out to go shopping and she comes home with the groceries in the car and the husband says, hey, did you go to 3 grocery stores before you bought all those things? And why didn't you talk to me about whether we were going to have, you know, Target food or, Walmart food? And why didn't you pre-check with me about these things every single time? It's a failure of trust. And we would know that marriage is in distress.
Oh
The
boy.
reason I think that this illustration catches it is because churches that you and I know of still function on a model very similar to that. And it's so important to fix that leadership edge because of at least three big issues. Big issue number one, the souls of the shepherds hang an account of how they lead. Secondly, the souls of the flock hang an account how they're led. And thirdly, God is asking us to do a great work as to being the manifold wisdom of God made manifest. And if the garbage we're putting out there is this dysfunctional, broken model of a local church, then we're not ever going to be able to accomplish what God needs us to do. You mentioned Ezekiel 34. I think this is a great time for us to kind of pick through that text. And I'm sure you've got it open. It looks like you do. Um, I think there's some really healthy and powerful truths that really kind of fit into not just this discussion, but all of our perspective to the work of shepherds in the context of the flock of God.
Yeah, Ezekiel 34 is a condemnation of the shepherds of Israel, Philip. And Ezekiel says in 34:2, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, thus says the Lord God to the shepherds. And of course, the shepherds in Israel at this time would have been the kings, the prophets, priests, the princes, the elders of the nation. And he says, woe to the shepherds of Israel who feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flocks? And so here in the very opening of the chapter, you see that part of the problem was that these men were in it for themselves. They were not in it for the benefit of the flock. He says in verse 3, you eat the fat and clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the flock. And so twice here he's talked about feeding the flock. And then in verse 4, verses 4 and 5 and 6 are just the strongest possible condemnation you could imagine. And everything in these verses is negative. But with every one of these negatives, as we look at it, we can learn something positive about what shepherds are supposed to do. He says in verse 4, the weak you have not strengthened. Here, shepherds are supposed to strengthen those that are weak. Nor have you healed those that were sick, nor bound up the broken, nor brought back what was driven away, nor sought what was lost, but with force and cruelty you have ruled them. This is how these men operated in Israel. But here you see that they should have strengthened the weak, they should have healed those that were sick, bound up the broken. In fact, the figurative language, the picture that Ezekiel draws here, is of a literal shepherd in a field who's taking care of the sheep who's got a broken leg, the one that has been driven away, the one that got lost. The shepherd goes out and seeks them. In the parable in Luke 15 of the man who has 100 sheep and one of them is lost, what does he do? He leaves the 99 and he goes out and he seeks the one that was lost. And so as a result of the cruel way that these shepherds were leading, verse 5 says, so they were scattered because there was no shepherd, and they became food for all the beasts of the field when they were scattered. My sheep wandered through all the mountains and on every high hill. Yes, my flock was scattered over the whole face of the earth, and no one was seeking or searching for them. You know, we often talk about why the northern kingdom went into Assyrian captivity and why Judah, the southern kingdom, went into Babylonian captivity. And we point to idolatry. And it was idolatry. But who was it that led the nation into idolatry? Whose careless leadership allowed this to prosper? It was these shepherds, these kings, these priests who allowed all of that to happen. And so judgment was now upon them.
Right. It really went from the top down. And you see that in the way the punishments laid out. You see that in the program God put in place for what was next for them. They're going to be in captivity and in bondage. They're going to grow in that context in many ways. When they came back, most of that particular type of idolatry didn't seem to come back with them. They had other problems, certainly, and then they found new ones down the road, but they kind of stomped out a lot of that. From a standpoint of congregations today, you mentioned you've kind of done your seminars, your teaching, your leadership weekends, about 50 churches over the most recent years. That's a small portion of the context of how many congregations are even in the U.S., let alone those who would be outside the boundaries of American borders. When we start reaching to those who teach, I want to encourage folks, because we're kind of getting close to the end of our timeline here, make plans in your preaching to teach in a way to address this vital issue, particularly if you want your congregation to grow. I've jokingly said before, the most important growth point for a congregation is not getting the very best speaker slash teacher slash pulpit guy. If you have great elders, you can replace that preacher with a blinking light and the scriptures rolling up on the screen. And you will probably be better off than the very best preacher you can find and garbage eldership. That's the dynamic that I see. In a lot of congregations, they keep cycling through their preachers but the preacher isn't the problem. The preacher comes in and tries to fix the problem, and the leadership in the group, elders are not. Sometimes it's men who are pocket elders who are doing more damage to the group than the effective evangelists can undo on a weekly basis.
And Philip, one of the first things that has to be recognized in this is that maybe the model that we've been following is not the biblical model. And so elders have to recognize there's a better way to do things, and going back and examining the scripture and learning about shepherding. I would recommend Two things. One, you're going to provide a link to the Don Truex video where he and I discussed the work of shepherding. Don is just an excellent teacher in that regard, and I recommend that folks take a look at that. But the other thing is once preachers begin to understand the shepherding model and the elders begin to understand shepherding, it really changes how you appoint men. You see, when I first started preaching, this is my 50th year of preaching, I worked with elders, and what you were looking for when it came to appointing elders, well, we're looking for good businessmen, men who've had a successful career here and there, because we need good decision makers. But now, if you stop and think about it, we're looking for men who can tend sheep. And it really changes how you view men. We have two or three of our men who serve as elders. We have 12 men who serve as shepherds right now. But two or three of them are not businessmen at all. They're not even business oriented. But they've got a heart that cares about people. And that really has influenced how we have appointed some of our men, because they love the sheep. There's so many stories I wish we had time to tell about the interaction between the shepherds and the sheep, and stories about how they have demonstrated love and care for the sheep. And I guess I would remind folks of Hebrews 13:17. If you and I are going to serve as shepherds, remember this, that we will give account. I think a lot of elders on the judgment day, they can hand God a bank book and say, here, Lord, here I've accounted for every penny the church ever had. And so we can account for all the money. But the Lord's going to ask about the sheep. How did we handle the sheep? Give account for them.
Yeah, I think that's a really important last point to leave us with the flock itself is the value that is the result of quality leadership. All the other stuff that takes place, whether it's a structurally sound group and the methods which they use their finances, if they're engaging in tremendous amounts of evangelism abroad because they're very efficient, all those kind of things are second in place to the hearts of the ones whom God entrusts those elders with. I remember talking with Larry Jones, who serves as one of the elders at Embry Hills. And Larry and I had a great conversation about his shift in focus towards the weakest parts of the congregation, those who are spiritually struggling, those who are constantly in and out of turmoil. He said, those are the people that you have to be able to get closest to you when you serve as an elder, because they need you more than the person who, and I'll say this generically but not accurately, has it all figured out. They really don't, but they have more of the things stable than those that don't. And shepherds really need to embrace that risky shift, because there's risk involved. There's emotional risk. There is, psychological risk, because you're going to get attached to people who are going to be in trouble, and it's going to be heartbreaking. And then it's also going to be joyful. Max, thanks for joining us with this. This has been an excellent conversation. If you're willing, we'd love to have you back again. Maybe Terry can join us at that time too.
Well, I would look forward to that. Thank you, Philip.
And for those who are listening, as always, as we close this out, a couple things of importance. One, if you find this interesting or valuable, suggest it to others. We really want to try to be a vehicle for encouragement to those who preach and teach primarily, but also the broad spectrum of our brethren. We love the work that you're doing in your congregations. We want to help with that as much as we can. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Terry was not able to be with us. He's at the hospital addressing some healthcare needs for his mother. And because I can say this with plainness, I know everyone who's watching this is concerned about Terry and his family. So pray for them, and more than you normally do. Pray for Terry, because that's usually a regular thing. But pray for his mom and pray for his family, so that whatever God can accomplish through them takes place. Broader than that, if you've got questions that we've talked about, message them to us. I'll make sure Max gets anything directly for him if folks have questions about that. If there's other ways that we can help you, please let us do that. Max, is there anything coming up in your agenda that you want to let people know about that you might see as valuable to those who would be watching today?
Well, as far as agenda goes, no. But let me Let me tag one scripture here at the end, and that's John chapter 10, Jesus the Good Shepherd. There are about 10 points that people can learn from Jesus in that text, but the primary thing is that the shepherd loves the sheep.
Yep. All right, everybody, have a great day. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Max. Everyone take care.
All right, bye-bye.